One said he'd stay right there, and then there were 7.
The 1920s and 1930s became known as the golden age of detective fiction. Many authors, such as Nicholas Blake, Christiana Brand, Edmund Crispin, and of course Agatha Christie, were achieving huge success with their whodunit mysteries, usually involving characters gathering in a large old house, and one or more of them not making it through the night. It wasn't long before many of these stories began getting film adaptations. In 1939, Elliot Nugent directed a horror comedy based on both the play by John Willard and a silent movie from 1927 called The Cat and the Canary, about a group of relatives gathering in a gothic house in the Louisiana bayou with a murderous killer known as the Cat prowling for his next victim. A few years later, Renee Clare directed an Agatha Christie adaptation called And Then There Were None.
7 little Indian boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in half. Then there were 6.
Which involved a group of strangers being invited to a house on an isolated island who are picked off one by one by a mysterious killer. Both films went on to be hugely influential in both the whodunit genre and the horror genre, and solidified this idea that the big old dark house is the perfect setting for a series of grisly murders.
This instrument, which you saw me remove from the back of the third victim, means only one thing: murder.
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss 2 murder mystery classics, The Cat and the Canary, and Then There Were None. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike Munzer. As ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th series, exploring the evolution of home invasion movies, and this is part 3. As that intro suggested, this week we are going to be exploring the world of murder mysteries and whodunits, and we're going to be talking about The Cat and the Canary from 1939. Followed by And Then There Were None from 1945. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. Don't spoil it for yourself. They're both murder mysteries. You've got to check these films out before you listen to our discussion. So, joining me to discuss these 2 bangers, it's a longtime friend of the pod. She is a film critic, a broadcaster, journalist, and she's my wife, and she's right here in the living room. Rhianna Dhillon, hello.
Hello, Michael Munzer.
Well, this is nice because we're going to talk about home invasion movies. This is what I've been talking about with everyone so far this series. Me and you share a home, so
yes, for my sins.
We share this fear together of something happening. What do you think of home invasion movies generally? Are these movies that you would gravitate towards?
Well, put it this way: when you told me that you were doing a home invasion series, I immediately had a nightmare like a couple of nights later about a home invasion before you'd even started watching any of the films.
Just from the mere mention.
Yeah, it's my worst subgenre, I would say, of horror, because it's because of the reality of it. I mean, you're going to get this all the way through, right? I don't think many people are, I don't know, genuinely terrified of, I don't know, zombies or vampires. But home invasion is something that I have always been really frightened of. And it's one of those subgenres that if you're watching Home Alone at night, which, you know, is often the way if you're watching something late on TV or something.
For a second, I thought you meant you were watching Home Alone at night. But yes,
that is also a home invasion. Are you covering Home Alone?
I am. With Rob Watts. Yeah.
Of course you're doing it with Rob. Amazing. So it's genuine. I do find it really scary. So I'm really glad that the ones that we've picked to talk about are not the extreme end of home invasion. Like I think Funny Games is one of the films that has, you know, when people talk about films scarring them the most, and it's always kind of like said slightly in jest, it really did damage me. I think that film, it frightened me more than any other film, because it was just there was no point to it.
Yeah.
You know, like the sort of the torture and everything. There was no reason behind it. It wasn't like a burglary gone wrong or anything like that. It was just for the pure pleasure of, you know, torturing this family. And that's just scared me so much.
Yeah, it's definitely a subgenre where when it's at its most extreme, that kind of shows the worst of human beings and what they do to each other as well. Because there's a lot of films like that too, like Straw Dogs, that also turn the invadees into monsters too, in order to protect their home and everything as well. And it's quite a bleak, nihilistic kind of subgenre in that regard.
It is, and the whole idea, because with Straw Dogs, that's Dustin Hoffman, isn't it? And his character, or, you know, if you watch the newer one, isn't it James Marsden, I think?
Oh, it could be. I can't remember.
And then I think Alexander Skarsgård plays the horrible
local that makes sense.
ex-boyfriend. But they almost are presented as cowards in a way, because they can't protect their homes, or they're unable to protect their homes and their families, and they're presented as like the beta males. And I find, you know, the psychology behind all of that is really interesting, but it is so horrible and it's so frightening, because it's almost about like the emasculation of these guys, but then what about the women who are the ones who are the kind of focal point of the torture and the horror?
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, without getting too, I've been asking people, you know, have they ever experienced anything close to this in real life before? And you've actually had something happen in our flat in London when I was away once, didn't you? Where you saw somebody running past the window.
Well, this is actually quite a banal thing in comparison to what, you know, home invasion actually is. But yeah, typically you were away, and there was a burglar, I think, or someone who was running from the police or something through all the gardens, and you know, our bedroom was on the ground floor, and they like heard them in the garden like scuffling about, and there were like multiple entrances to our bedroom at that point, and a huge window, and I was just there like rigid with terror, because the security light came on. I could see this figure going outside our window. Yeah, it was really frightening.
There was the one night I was away as well. So typical, isn't it? Yeah. How do you find it? We moved from London to now living in a slightly more rural place, and we're in a bigger house.
Yeah.
How do you find that? Do you find that less or more scary, you know, being in a city environment or being in a sort of quieter, more rural environment?
I think about exits a lot. I think, you know, I always had my exit plan in whichever flat we were in.
Yeah. It's harder in this. We're in a townhouse, so our bedroom is 3 floors up from the front door.
It is much harder, actually.
Yeah.
And like our bathroom doesn't have a window and that sort of thing. So if we got locked in the bathroom, there is no escape.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've thought about it. That's why I keep various little tools next to my bed, just in case.
It's true. You have got to think about it. But it's hard because our bedroom is just a sheer drop from our bedroom window.
Yep. Yes, it is.
That's.
I didn't think this was going to get quite so personal so quickly.
I've got to. We're talking about home invasion. I'm sharing a house with my guest. We have to talk about it. But we are talking about some slightly more fun movies as well. This is the thing. I'm not just doing a whole series of really bleak, horrible, violent stuff. You know, because I think there's been such a huge tradition in horror of movies just set within the home generally.
Yeah.
And anything from, you know, an apartment like in Rosemary's Baby to like a big gothic haunted house to like an old mansion to a suburban home, whatever. Mm-hmm. Why do you think the home itself is such a popular setting for horror?
Well, because the majority of people have one.
Yeah.
You know, everyone has to live kind of somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so it's the idea of your safe space being invaded, and if people love that adrenaline rush or that scare, I mean, what better way to do it than the idea of the place that you call home actually not being that safe space anymore.
And there's something quite fun about, especially in the films we're going to talk about, you know, these houses that have, you know, secret passageways.
It's so exciting. Yeah. It's like the reason, you know, it's like classic Famous Five and finding all these secret panels and library doors. library walls that are actually doors, and that's the fantasy that we both share, I think.
Yes.
Like, I would absolutely love to live in a place that had a
library bookcase door.
Yeah.
100%. 100%.
And it just I think it makes every adult into a child.
Yeah.
Like the idea of exploring in that way is like my favorite thing to do if you go anywhere.
Yeah.
Is just to kind of seek out those nooks and crannies. Yeah, it's really exciting.
And it makes for such great mystery stories, I suppose, right? And I guess really what we're looking at, these two movies are sort of mystery stories.
Yeah.
Even more than they are horror, really. But I think what's interesting is they kind of have their roots. They are sort of the roots of a lot of horror. So we'll talk about it, but And Then There Were None is sort of a slasher format before slashers existed, and it's not obviously a slasher movie, And Then There Were None, it's a mystery story, but that kind of body count format and who's the murderer, you can see the through line going all the way through to movies like Ready or Not, for example, right? And then similarly with The Cat and the Canary, you can almost see that line all the way through to like Knives Out, that a bunch of people gather to read a will in a house, and, somebody's out to kill somebody, we collectively just love these types of stories, don't we, I think?
Yeah, and also it's tapping very much into what is huge at the moment, the whole idea of privilege and eat the rich.
Yeah.
And that sort of, we talked about that a lot with all of the films, that we've been watching in the last few years, and TV shows, obviously, with The White Lotus. So this kind of was doing that at the very beginning, because I guess the whole idea of having a home and or a house, especially one that you own, is a privilege.
Yeah.
And it is more for the wealthy.
Yes.
So it's kind of, it's giving us, it's not preying, it's not a punching down sort of genre quite so much, I suppose.
No, you get very few home invasion movies set in kind of working class environments. It's usually, like you say, it's Jordan Peele's Us, for example. It's the haves being targeted by the have-nots often, or it is like what we're about to talk about, a bunch of grotesque rich people killing each other in a house or something. Yeah.
I guess The Purge, was it, which one? I can't remember which Purge it was. Not the first one, was it? But
well, the whole of the Purge universe, in a way, is that same theme.
But and there's one where it's kind of flipped almost, isn't it? Where
we're out on the streets. Yes, which is less, because that's not home invasion, obviously. No. But we are going to talk about the first Purge movie, which is very much affluent home who can afford decent security from whatever nonsense is going on outside. So it's
all a commentary, isn't it?
So much. The people
home ownership
the people under the stairs is a brilliant one in that regard as well, about kind of gentrification and the ghettos and these white people living in this huge house that are kind of, again, literally eating the poor in that film. So there's going to be a lot of really interesting class stuff to explore throughout this series as well,
which is going to be interesting because it's so much more nuanced than some of the zombie films that you've had to cover, for example.
I mean, zombie movies have that sort of social commentary too when they're good, but yes, you're right. Like, I think there's more scope, and there's that classic thing with this series, with this genre, because they're more human based. They often are. It's that thing of, are they a thriller and not a horror? And somehow are slightly more respected. Again, when we talk about films like Rebecca or Gaslight or Rear Window or Rope, or some of these more prestigious movies, they tend to get labelled thriller rather than horror, often because they're kind of human, non-supernatural stories, but often because they star like A-list actors and that kind of thing as well. And there's a bit of that in this kind of subgenre as well, which is interesting.
And we all know that horror doesn't sell, so...
Yeah, exactly, yeah. No one likes horror. So let's get into it. We're going to start by talking about The Cat and the Canary from 1939.
In the event that the heir hereinafter named should prove to be of unsound mind, or if said heir should become insane or should meet death within a month of inheriting, then my estate is to be given to the person whose name is contained in envelope number 2.
Well, that will is practically an invitation to commit murder.
I remember a situation almost like this in an old play called The Fatal Hour, or She Should Have Known Better. At the end of the second act, the leading man takes the heroine in his arms and he kisses her.
I'll attempt to do a little plot synopsis of this. It's quite a complicated plot, actually, because there's quite a lot of characters and there's quite a lot going on. But essentially, we focus in on this. At the beginning of the film, a bunch of characters arrive by boat at this mansion house in the kind of Louisiana bayou, owned by somebody called Cyrus Norman, who is dead. He died 10 years earlier. But a bunch of his relatives have been gathered at this house at midnight to read the will of Cyrus Norman and find out who his kind of estate is being passed on to. So we meet a bunch of people, a whole group of characters all at once. You've got our main character, I suppose you could call her, Joyce, played by Paulette Goddard. Then you've got Fred and Charles, these two sort of generic middle-aged men in suits, right?
Yeah.
And you've got Cicely and Aunt Susan, who are these two sort of batty old ladies, yes. Right? And then you've got Wally Campbell, played by Bob Hope, who's very much the kind of the comedic centre of the film as well.
Comedic being very much in inverted commas there.
So the group gathers in the parlour to read the will, and this is amazing. An unseen gong rings 7 times, and according to Miss Lou, who's kind of the housemaid / mistress of the millionaire that lived here, she says that this means that only 7 of the 8 people will survive the night. Norman's will is read. It's in 2 parts. The first part indicates that Joyce will inherit the entire estate, but under one condition, that concerned about a streak of insanity in the family's blood.
Love that.
Norman stipulates that his heir must remain sane for the next 30 days. If Joyce loses her sanity during that time, the heir will be determined from the second part of the will. The arrangement raises concerns about Joyce's safety, obviously, since other family members can increase their chances of inheriting by murdering or driving her insane. There's also, we are told by a random policeman, a prowler on the loose, a serial killer known as the Cat, who has escaped from a nearby asylum. So then what happens is we follow the family throughout the night. They spend the night in this mansion. There is potentially this prowler on the loose, and we are concerned for the safety of this poor woman, Joyce, who may be murdered / driven insane in order to have her fortune stolen from her. Cue lots of like people popping out of bookcases and hands coming out in beds and all these other things going on throughout the night.
Yeah.
So what did you think of The Cat and the Canary?
Just you reading all of that back just reminds me of how like batshit this story is.
It's really fun. And of course, this is a film that is based on a novel. There was also a play. There was also another movie version in the 1920s, a kind of silent movie version as well. And there's been a couple of adaptations since. So it's a story that has remained really popular and has been told over and over again. But this is one of the most famous versions of this story.
It was like you pointed out throughout, they do keep making references to the acts, like the 3 acts.
Yes, that's right. And they make jokes about plays and stuff like that.
All the time, because Bob Hope is playing an actor, and so he keeps referring to it as like a whodunnit, you know? Like it's very self-referential.
Yes.
And you just turn to me and like, can you guess this used to be a play? Yes. And the trouble with this movie is that it has Bob Hope in it because it completely derails the story because it's just all about like his one-liners and his quips, and we both got very quickly fed up of Bob Hope being the sort of central starring role because he had to just have it was so like scenery chewing and so over the top, and it just kind of did take away from the actual plot most of the time. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? You're right. I think this film is really fun. I had a lot of fun with it. Yeah. And I think the story's great. And for the most part, the characters are great.
And the house is amazing.
The house is amazing.
Genuinely.
The film looks beautiful. It's directed by Elliot Nugent, and I think it looks amazing. The kind of shadowy rooms and...
Agreed.
But yes, Bob Hope is
Bob Hope, basically.
Like, it's like he's like this celebrity cameo, but he's a main star. Yeah. And he is just playing Bob Hope through it, right? And it just sounds a bit like at times Bob Hope is just riffing and just being Bob Hope and being funny and doing his little bits and doing his little one-liners, which, you're right, I think for both of us kind of took us out of the mystery plot element somewhat. Yes. And that's fine. I mean, I guess like people at the time came to watch and love Bob Hope.
That's true.
That was kind of the selling point of the movie, I think, that he was this big star, this big comedy star, this kind of vaudeville guy, right?
But I think it was to the detriment of some of the other characters because, for example, like, you just said, there are two middle-aged men in suits or whatever. I mean, I think they're quite young men. I think they're only supposed to be in their 20s.
Yeah, but 1930s.
Yeah, exactly.
You go from being a teenager to a man in his 40s, I think, in those days. Yeah. Now listen here, say here. Yeah.
So I think it's because he has so much screen time that the other peripheral characters don't get as much, and it means that they're obviously not developed enough. So either they become extreme stereotypes like the batty ladies, who are very much like straight out of Fawlty Towers, aren't they? Like the two old ladies in Fawlty Towers, and or they just have nothing to do. Like there's this guy, I think he's called Fred in it. John Beale plays Fred Blythe. He literally does fuck all in this movie, and it's such a shame because actually I think he's the grumpy one. He's like just suspicious of everyone and everything, and he's just cross all the way through.
And there's a moment when he nearly starts a fight with Charlie, right? The other guy. They hate each other. Or something. Yeah, we don't really know too much why exactly.
It's just because they're like
cross men.
Yeah. Desperate to show off their masculinity. So it's a shame because the whole point of these sort of ensemble casts is that you do get to know them all, which is what Knives Out does quite well. You get a good flavour of everybody in that.
You sort of do, but then I was thinking there's a little bit of that to Knives Out as well. Like, I love all those actors in it because the actors are brilliant. But Jamie Lee Curtis, does she play... Basically, it's kind of like how we just described that man. She plays a sort of cross... Matriarch, yeah. And, Michael Shannon plays a kind of like slightly weird, creepy, sort of middle-aged man. So, yeah, like...
But you kind of get their vibes and their motivations a bit more, whereas I don't know what Fred's motivation is at all, like you said, for being there or anything.
Yeah. They're sort of stock characters in a way, aren't they? But yeah, you're right. It's very much the Bob Hope show.
Although I do think that Paulette Goddard, who actually at one point, she had 4 husbands, but she was at one point married to Charlie Chaplin.
Yes, that's right.
It's so interesting. I always find it interesting putting these eras of movie stars together because it's not quite ever how I think it is. So she plays Joyce, who is the sole beneficiary of the will.
Yeah.
She, I think, is actually excellent in this movie because she kind of gets that it's a comedy drama, whereas Bob Hope is just like, oh, this is an out and out vaudeville show.
Yeah, it's interesting. She's playing it like she's in a horror movie or a drama, exactly.
But she has the humour and the twinkle that kind of makes it amusing.
Yes,
and she's not trying to go for the lol every time.
I know, everything Bob Hope says, you just expect a little ba-da-bum.
Yeah, exactly.
Or a little like canned laughter from a sitcom or something.
Yeah, like they even leave the pause. Yeah,
yeah, it does. It feels very old school in that regard. It reminds me of the kind of Marx Brothers comedies of the 30s. There's almost a bit of Groucho Marx about him with his one. He's not as funny as Groucho Marx, though, I think. But yes.
But I do think that Paulette Goddard is very good as Joyce. And I'm glad that she is actually she is a strong character and she has her own sort of motivation and her own ambition and her own autonomy throughout, unlike some of the others.
I really liked Gail Sondergaard's character of Miss Lou. I wish there was more of her.
I know.
She was interesting, wasn't she?
She basically plays Mrs. Danvers.
That's right. There's a real Mrs. Danvers vibe to her, which is what I'm discussing next week, funnily enough. Gail Sondergaard was the first ever recipient of the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress.
Oh, for this film?
No, in 19... So she'd already had one by this point. It was in 1936, Anthony Adverse, which I've never seen. And then she went on to be in The Mask of Zorro in 1940 as well, and a bunch of others. But yeah, she's a really great actress, and these actors all are good, actually, in a lot of ways. And I don't think Bob Hope is bad. It's just that he's doing his Bob Hope thing. Whereas, for me, it didn't quite fit in the movie as well as, I loved that from the get-go, we meet her straight away, and she's this weird, creepy, like you say, Miss Danvers-esque woman who's lived alone in this house, presumably for 10 years since he died, the millionaire, in the middle of the bayou. And, you know, that setup is kind of really interesting. And I wanted a little bit more of that. I wanted a bit more of her in this movie.
Oh, totally agree. Because like you say, she's really interesting. She believes in spirits and talks to the spirits. And that's what I did quite like about the opening of this, is that you're not sure if it is supernatural or not, because the whole idea of the cat.
Yes, and there is actually a black cat.
There's a black cat who looks like Cosmic Creepers from Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Yes.
So they really kind of play into that, and the kind of the mystical bayou. They have a Native American guide sort of rowing people in.
Yes, both these films we talk about today have people arriving via boat to the house, right? Which is interesting at the beginning of the film. But
I really loved her. I thought she was brilliant, and absolutely wanted more of her, because she kind of got the campness.
Yes,
kind of very arch and hides behind doors, and you know, raises her eyebrows.
And there's this other sort of through line that we're going to focus on more in the next couple of weeks about women being left alone in homes. You can kind of trace it back to Miss Avisham, I think, in a way. This idea, you know, we're going to talk about it with Sunset Boulevard and Baby Jane, these kind of, for want of a better phrase, sort of mad women left alone in homes, really, right? And you know, I think that there's a bit of that in Mrs. Danvers, of course, in Rebecca as well, and but
I don't know with her. I don't think that Miss Lou does come across as mad. But because
she's superstitious.
Yes. So the others sort of immediately view her as other.
Yes, she's definitely othered compared to the relatives that arrive, right?
Yes, she is.
What do you think of the house then? Again, like the home itself in all of these movies is so important. The production design and the setting. I always love a Louisiana kind of, you know, swampy bayou kind of setting, right? But what do you think of this big old mansion that we're in? It's
such a weird thing, because I suppose I usually associate mansions with old English countrysides or American sort of new American.
Yes, newer builds. Yeah.
Whereas this is kind of completely, like you said, it's in a swamp, and there are alligators everywhere. And there's this kind of weird misty garden which you never see in daylight. So it is always shrouded in darkness, and it's very enigmatic. You can't really get to grips with the blueprint of this house and the garden and the tunnels and everything. And that's kind of part of the charm.
It's great, isn't it? I guess it's what people would call Southern Gothic. It's Southern, isn't it? And yes. And of course, you know, it doesn't lean into this at all, but you do think of sort of class stuff when it comes to American houses like this, because these were often the slave owner homes, right? They were often plantations, and especially in Louisiana and places like that, you know, as well.
It's deliberately very isolated and very lonely, to the point, like you say, where you can only get to it by boat. You can't walk there. You know, you can't really turn up unexpectedly unless you're a policeman who is on the hunt for a prowling cat. I don't know. That was a bit weird how he just popped in. He's like, oh yeah, there's a local asylum. It's like, is there?
Where is this asylum? Yeah, it's so true. I'm just imagining all these escaped mental patients just on boats, you know, just rowing their ways to various homes. But yeah, it's true. Like it's weird geography that doesn't quite make sense. And because you're right, it takes place across one night. We never see this place in daylight.
No.
I don't think, do we, until maybe the very, very end of the film.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love it. I love the house itself. I think, and the way it's shot, I think especially because we watched these films the other way around, and Then There Were None is a great film, but I think it has a more sort of televisual look in a way.
It's cheaper.
It looks cheaper. It looks grainier, and whereas this looks really beautiful.
Yeah,
I think this looks like a proper Hollywood movie.
Yeah.
In the way it's shot and lit. I love the kind of secret passageways, the candlelight, the big winding staircases, the shadows, the doors opening, the little passage, the hatches behind the beds, and all that kind of stuff. It's great, isn't it?
There are so many, because they have all of that. The door, the library wall full of books that is actually a door, and then the moving panels, and also brilliantly, which always makes me think of Albert, the Fifth Musketeer.
That's a deep cut reference.
But in Albert, in that there's they have a portrait in one of the hallways, which the mad woman, she uses it with like to peek through. So she replaces the eyes of the portrait.
Yes.
So that's what happens in this. In the movie, where the eyes of the portrait are actually the burglar's eyes.
Yes.
Whoever it is, the murderer.
Yes, it reminds me, we all have our reference points.
Yeah.
I saw that for the first time in Carry On Screaming.
Oh.
Carry On Screaming, which is obviously a riff on these types of movies,
yeah.
but when somebody arrives at the house, Fenella Fielding is looking at them all through the eyes of a painting, and they're like, the eyes look like they're moving. It's great. Yeah, it has all the kind of tricks in the book, this movie, doesn't it? Of those sorts of, it has all of it kind of. I don't think it's the first, but it's one of the first real popular movies to kind of, utilize all those tropes.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I've only ever really seen that done as a parody.
Yeah.
And like it's it is a comedy.
This is a comedy. Yeah, exactly.
But I'm not sure how that's I don't know if that particular bit is supposed to be that hilarious. Yeah. But it is hilarious.
But right, I mean, it is a comedy and it's not scary for the most part. You gasped at one moment when the
loudly.
Hands... Yeah,
I loudly gasped, guys.
Yeah, you had quite the reaction to one sort of jump scare where the hands suddenly emerge above Paulette Goddard's character in bed, right?
It's genuinely frightening because... Don't laugh at me.
No, it was creepy. It was creepy.
Because I think at that point we'd seen the eyes, but we'd seen bodies disappearing, and this was like the first. I don't know. It was a real moment of malintent, I suppose. And again, it's that whole idea of a hand. I once had a nightmare that a hand was holding my hand in bed, and in that like in between sleep and wake, and I screamed and I was like, I can't, it's a dead cold hand. And it was just my other hand.
It was just my hand.
No, I was in bed alone. It was your other hand. My other hand.
That's amazing.
But it had gone numb. So I was just holding my own numb hand.
Jesus.
It was terrifying.
That in itself is quite scary.
I know.
Yeah.
So when I saw that just took me back to that moment of just like the idea of a disembodied hand coming at you, because we don't know who it is in this.
No.
And we don't know really what they want.
No. No, there's this. So the mystery element of it is interesting because, yes, you're right. It's like, is it the cat? Is it the prowler that's escaped a loony bin and it's just coming to kill them just because?
Loony bin.
I'm using very...
So PC.
I know, I'm sorry. I'm using very dated terminology for that place, but it's because we're talking about a 1930s film. Apologies. Yes, is it just somebody who's escaped a psychiatric hospital, or is it somebody trying to kill her or freak her out or drive her insane because they want the money, right, from the will? And that mystery kind of bubbles over throughout the whole film, doesn't it? How did you find that, the mystery element itself, the plot, and how that kind of unfolded? Were you kind of intrigued by it? Did you have your kind of suspects or guesses or anything like that?
I don't know if they were really even giving us enough information for us to try and guess who it is. I was very suspicious of Bob Hope.
Just because you didn't like him.
Just because I didn't like him. But also there's a bit right at the beginning where Charlie, who is one of the men in suits, he's sort of like the good-looking, dashing, charming one, and he's trying it on with Joyce, and she's a bit like, you did bin me off though, and now you're trying to get back in my favour. And she was like, let's talk about it tomorrow.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, that's interesting. He's not to be trusted, quite clearly.
Yes.
Elizabeth Patterson plays Aunt Susan. Aunt Susan is particularly cross and suspicious about this will because she hasn't been included in it. And so any chance she gets, she calls Joyce mad.
Yes.
Like at the drop of a hat, like even before she's even started to show any signs of perhaps losing it a little bit. She's just like, well, she's clearly nuts.
She's mad. Stick her in the loony bin round the corner, apparently.
So it's not so much that she was a genuine suspect, but she was clearly very happy to play along with them. And the idea that she's given 30 days to go insane, otherwise she gets to keep the money.
So good.
And that's
such
really
a premise.
Weird, isn't it? So weird. But instead of using the 30 days, they decided to use 12 hours to to try and make her go completely insane by mentally torturing her and disappearing bodies, and because she's talking to the lawyer at one point, and then he just disappears behind the wall.
And that's right, the lawyer is the first victim, right? He's killed, but he's not technically one of the 8, so we still don't know which one of the 8 is going to die at that point. It's fun. I love that moment when he gets pulled behind the bookshelf and she just doesn't notice.
No, it's hilarious. She's like chatting away. I'd be like that. Chat, and then you just be gone.
No idea what's happening behind you.
It is escalated very quickly over the one night. But it is, like you say, it is very entertaining because it's in quick succession. And it's not like there's not a huge body count in this.
No, and it zips along. It's only 70 minutes long as well. So it's,
I could almost have had a bit longer, really. If they'd fleshed it out a bit more.
Agreed. Could have spent a bit more time with some of these other suspects or characters.
So
maybe.
that we got a bit more suspicious, or kind of, I kind of wanted my loyalties to change. Didn't really have the chance to do that.
Because I think we'll talk about this, but I think you have that a bit more in And Then There Were None. That Agatha Christie touch of ooh, okay, we were really, discussing it throughout, weren't we? Who's it going to be and this kind of thing,
This almost feels slightly less of a whodunit. I do think it's such a cliche, isn't it? But the house is a character in its own right. And what I really enjoy is how they then almost make it into a treasure hunt with finding this diamond necklace, which is almost like the crux of the will. Or there's this whole other line about the will, and there's a limerick or a poem that they have to figure out. Do you remember?
Right, I'm getting it confused with the 10 Little Indians poem, but hang on, no, maybe
so there's
not.
a sort of little poem that they have to translate, and it's in the garden. They go and have to
of course,
under like a fountain or a statue.
It's a bit like the Traitors, isn't it?
Yes, it is like the Traitors.
In fact, that's the other kind of through line you can see to this, right? The Traitors.
That's such a good point, because I kept thinking of the Traitors Library in my head, but I didn't actually verbalise that.
Great. Maybe I should cover the Traitors in this series. Love it.
100%. A faithful. I do. I think I really enjoyed that they then went off into like this other territory of the treasure hunt, and then the diamond necklace gets stolen right underneath her pillow by this wandering hand.
And then there's a weird sort of twist where the policeman who comes to warn them all about the prowler is actually just there so he can steal a necklace, right? Steal the necklace. And there's a moment when he's hiding in a passageway, which is quite a creepy image. He's just hiding in the dark, waiting for the prowler, whoever it is, to walk past.
He's working in tandem with the prowler.
That's right.
So he's pretending to be an officer from this asylum, but actually him and the prowler are in cahoots.
That's right.
Because they were going to share the wealth, although of course the prowler was never intending to share the wealth, but it was just his way of sort of ensuring that his reputation as this burglar, although what I didn't quite understand was the idea of this guy coming to warn them that this cat person was on the loose, because then they were on the lookout for somebody on the loose, whereas if they didn't warn them in the first place, they wouldn't have been on the lookout for anyone, and it could have been a bit more subtle. But then I guess it couldn't have been called The Cat and the Canary, so maybe I'm splitting hairs here.
Well, yes, they didn't need to have that twist where they're in cahoots, did they? But then the cat kills him pretty quickly, right? The prowler kills him, so the cat walks past the guard who stops him, takes the necklace from him, but then the cat stabs the guard in the back and continues to stalk Joyce. But
because I think this guy he's only interested in the necklace. He doesn't want him to keep killing people. He's actually a good burglar.
It's a good burglar.
And he doesn't want unnecessary deaths because they've already had to kill people. And but the cat actually wants the money from the will as well as the diamond necklace. So he wants to keep killing.
So eventually, in the final act, we do discover that the cat is Charlie.
Charming Charlie, one of the generic men in suits. He is the one who is trying to kill/drive Joyce insane, right? So that he can take the money. Because in the second part of the will that is never found, because he's stolen it, it says that he is the sole beneficiary.
Yes.
If she goes mad.
Or
dies.
Go. Yeah. So we get that kind of final showdown, and there's some stabbing, right? Doesn't Charles stab Wally?
I think he just stabs his coat, to be honest.
Right.
But Wally freaks out enough that he might as well have just gutted him.
But thankfully, Miss Lou arrives. Hero Miss Lou arrives and kills him with a shotgun.
Yeah.
Right. So let's have more of her. Like, where was her film?
Let's have the spin-off.
Yeah. Where was her film? She was brilliant.
She does prowl. I mean, she does prowl like a cat.
Yeah,
throughout,
she does.
because she just kind of like pops up in various bedrooms for no reason, takes bullets out of guns for no reason, and they're very much trying to be like, she's suspicious.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think she's just trying to protect her property. She's lived on it for 10 years. She doesn't even have a bloody look in with this will.
Yeah, she doesn't need all these people.
No.
Yeah, so there you go. That's The Cat and the Canary. I mean, yeah, what do you think of it? How do you think it... I mean, like, this movie is now, 70, nearly 80 years old. How do you think it holds up?
It's... I don't know. It's a fun mystery. I like that it does lean into the comedy a little bit, that it's not trying to be too over the top frightening, but then it maybe goes too much the other way with being a bit too hearty in places. But I do think, you have a strong central character in Joyce. You sort of don't believe that she would go mad that quickly, because she does seem genuinely very sensible and aware. But of course, you would be terrified out of your wits if somebody was deliberately going out of their way to try and terrify you. But I found it genuinely entertaining.
It's really fun, isn't it? Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it as well. And you're right, I think for me, technically, it holds up really well. Really well. I think it looks beautiful, and it's really well directed and blocked and everything. All these moments of hands and people disappearing in the background, and just like generally the way this film is directed is brilliant.
It's very glamorous, and it's got a sheen to it, hasn't it? Joyce, when she goes to bed, is wearing the most beautiful nightgown that could be like fit for a ball.
Oh yeah, that's so funny, isn't it?
It was amazing.
Yeah, it's like the most glamorous nightgown I've ever seen in my life. Yeah.
So embellished.
She literally, like you said, she looks like she could be walking down a red carpet in that night dress.
Yes.
Yeah, it's amazing. But
it really puts my pajamas to shame.
But yes, some of the I think it's just the comedy that's dated a bit, really. It's that vaudeville Bob Hope comedy.
I can't remember like a single joke, really. No. I can't really remember what the comedy is, because it's so nothing, to be honest. But yeah, I like the quick repartee. It's that kind of classic old, 30s, 40s.
Yeah.
Boom, 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 boom. Very, very fast. Back and forth, which I like. And, I do think that Joyce shows that she's a match for Wally. They really push the romance angle. And I was just like, I don't buy it in the slightest. Didn't need that. Didn't buy it.
Yeah.
There was no chemistry between them at all. And I think apparently at the end it's like a bit of a screwball ending.
Yeah.
Where they announce there are loads of press suddenly that have turned up in the bayou, and they announce their engagement sort of, and it's all a bit rushed and a bit weird, and they only met like 12 hours before, remember?
And this was this is the same as what we talked about last week with The Old Dark House and The Raven as well, that these movies that they sort of teeter into horror, but they always have this kind of happily ever after. Now the surviving couple are going to get engaged, kind of like, or they kiss, and it ends on a very kind of upbeat note. I suppose it's
a weird little thing to shove in. It's a weird little another genre to shove in when we don't really have it all the way through, and then they're suddenly like, and this.
Yeah, it feels like it's got to end with a kiss or something similar, it's hilarious. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed it, and I think you can see, I think it's historically interesting, this movie, and kind of what it's probably inspired and what's come after it. So.
Yeah, I think that's really fair, and it does desperately make me want to go and explore an old mansion.
Yeah,
like do an escape room in an old mansion.
Yeah, exactly.
If anyone knows of any, get in touch.
Exactly.
You called me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spit upon my Jewish gabardine. Well, then it now appears you need my help. Shall I bend low and in a bondsman's key with bated breath and whisper whispering humbleness saith it.
What an absolute banger. That is a clip you just heard there from the brilliant Theatre of Blood from 1973, the Vincent Price masterpiece, which turns 50 years old this year. Can you believe it? To celebrate its 50th anniversary, I'm going to be hosting a very special screening of Theatre of Blood in London on the 24th of May. If you can, please come along to the Genesis Cinema on the 24th of May for a very special event. It's going to be in collaboration with the Vincent Price Foundation. There's going to be an exhibition in the lobby beforehand with some Vincent Price memorabilia, props, costumes, that kind of thing. Then we're going to be screening Theatre of Blood on the big screen for its 50th anniversary. And then I'm going to be hosting a panel to discuss the film live on stage with some truly exciting guests. I'm going to be joined by Madeline Smith, who is one of the last remaining cast members from the film. She's going to be there. And I will also be joined by the one and only Reece Shearsmith, of course, actor, creator of Inside Number 9, League of Gentlemen, a whole bunch of other stuff that we all love. He is a huge fan of Theatre of Blood, and he is going to be joining me on stage to discuss the film in depth. It's going to be a really special night. So if you want to grab tickets, they're on sale now. Grab them while you can. evolutionofhorror.com/events. Not only that, we've got so much other exciting stuff coming up over the next couple of months. I'm going to be making my first trip to Birmingham with the Evolution of Horror in May. On Thursday, the 18th of May, I'm going to be at the Flat Pack Festival in Birmingham at the Mockingbird Cinema. In the afternoon, I'm going to be hosting a special podcasting masterclass for whoever wants to come along to that. And in the evening, I am going to be presenting a screening of The Lair of the White Worm from 1988. 35 years old this year, the Ken Russell schlocky campy classic starring Hugh Grant. I'm going to be introducing the film, and then I'm going to be recording a live podcast discussion afterwards. I'll be joined on stage by Liz Bishop from Ghouls Magazine, friend of the pod Becky Dark, and the brilliant Tim Coleman, friend of this pod, and of course editor and host of the Moving Pictures Film Club. So that's going to be a really fun night. And another event that I've got to quickly plug, also happening in London in May, I'm going to be hosting a 90th anniversary screening of The Invisible Man, and that's going to be at the Regent Street Cinema, and that is going to be a really fun one. I'm going to be joined on stage by Becky Dark, Kim Newman and Kevin Lyons to discuss the film live on stage. So if you want to come along to that, see The Invisible Man, hang out with me and Kim and Kev and Becky afterwards, then just grab your ticket. Tickets are available for all of these events right now. We've also got the Birds happening in Brighton next week and more events to be announced around the UK very soon. So evolutionofhorror.com/events will have all of the details of what we've got coming up. And if you want to be the first to hear about new events as they get announced, then just head to evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter and hear our regular updates.
Renfield, bring in innocent victims. I want a handful of nuns, a busload of cheerleaders.
And I just want a normal life again.
That was a little clip you just heard there from the new movie Renfield. It's another Dracula film, because we really need another Dracula film. This time it's Nicolas Cage playing the Count and Nicholas Hoult playing Renfield. And that is one of the many films, new releases, that we're going to be covering on this month's Fresh Blood. Fresh Blood is our monthly review strand in which me, Brad Hanson, Becky Dark and Louise Blaine discuss everything new and fresh in the world of horror. From video games to films that are on streaming to TV shows and even podcasts we review. So if you want to check out this week's episode, we have so much cool and interesting stuff to discuss, including Evil Dead Rise, Renfield, and the new Dead Ringers TV show starring Rachel Weisz, among many, many other things. Patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. $5 per month will get you access to Fresh Blood, as well as another bonus episode every single month. $10 per month will get you access to a new episode every single week, and you'll also get access to all of our exclusive mini-seasons. We are just kicking off a Final Destination retrospective mini-season in which me and various friends of the pod are going to discuss discuss every single film in that brilliantly fun series. So $10 patrons will get access to that. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a little thank you on the main podcast. So I am now going to thank everyone that signed up in the month of February. So a big thank you to Mel Hawkins, Marissa Miller, Beck, Mark Reed, Mark Harridan, Spoonbeans, Benjamin Neveau, Jewel Gould, William Lamb, Talia Colley, Essa Pottenan, Joey Edsel, Carl Witham, John Rapson, Edgar Tenorio, Jazz, Alexis Blesher, Carey Ostertag, Charlene L, Scott Irwin, Dave Bluestein, Corey Mamorella, Chris Richardson, JT Spranklin, Andrew Robeson, Cameron Bullock, Eugene O'Sullivan, Derek Quattro, Halloween J7, Meg Allen, Alex Barrett, Maggie, Querida Ellis, Lily Yengel, Jared Dwyer, Claire Lawrenson, Michael Kirshner, Darren Merlot, Silo, and Helene Hiskin. Thank you so much to all of those people for your kindness and generosity. And one more time, if you want to join them, help support the making of this podcast, and get treated to loads of bonus content, then sign up now. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode, in which Rhianna Dhillon and I get into some Agatha Christie, and we discuss And Then There Were None from 1945.
4 little Indian boys going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3. 3 little Indian boys walking in the snow. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2.
The place for nursery rhymes is in the nursery. Don't worry, Judge. He's down to the last Indian.
2 little Indian boys sitting in the sun. One got all frizzled up, and then there was 1. 1 little Indian boy left all alone. Какой ужас. So he went and hanged himself, and then there were none.
Where do we even begin with this one? Because this is based on a 1939 Agatha Christie novel of the same name. It also has other titles, which we'll get into in a minute. But And Then There Were None is essentially your quintessential body count story, essentially, right? So we have 10 people, all strangers to each other, are invited to a small isolated island just off the coast of Devon in England. So we are in the UK here rather than in the US. Owned by a mysterious Mr. Owen, who we don't know and none of the strangers know. Basically, once they arrive, they sit down and have dinner. The host is missing.
Absent.
He's absent. And there is a centerpiece in the middle of the dining table of 10 little Native Americans. And there's a record that one of the staff in the house puts on, and it's got a recording of a voice of this host, this man, who essentially reveals that all 10 of his guests are murderers. They are all in some way responsible for the death of someone else, but they all kind of got away with it, essentially. And he basically, the recording just sort of reveals all of their crimes, right? And kind of exposes them to one another. And then, for the rest of the movie, they all start dying, essentially, right? The first one is poisoned, and then different people in this house all die in different ways. They can't leave the house because, again, the only way to get there is by boat, and nobody is coming to pick them up until the end of the weekend. So these 10 people, or 9 people, or 8 people, all have to spend the weekend in this house, not knowing who the murderer is and not knowing who is going to die next. And all of the deaths are based on this poem called 10 Little Indians. And, you know, they are sort of, the deaths kind of relate to the poem, don't they? So for example, there's like 10 little Indians went out to dine, one choked his little self, and then there were 9. And the first person that dies in the film is poisoned, so there's that kind of link to choking. So yes, so this is the story. It's Agatha Christie. It's a whodunit. It's a body count movie. Pretty, you know, set the template, I suppose, in a lot of ways for these types of stories.
Yeah.
What did you think of it? It's quite a famous story, but were you very familiar with it going in?
I wasn't super familiar. I had seen other variations of it. There are like multiple. There's one kind of a bit more traditional BBC version, I think, with Aidan Turner in, and there was also one that was kind of all set on a farm, which is again a bit more of a whodunnit rather than they're all dying, I think, from what I can remember. So yeah, I didn't go into this being like, oh, I know who it is, which was good because you never want to go into a film doing that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I'm sort of familiar with this story, but I hadn't ever seen this version, and I'd completely forgotten who the murderer is or was supposed to be. Yeah. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the experience of this movie. I think I prefer this to The Cat and the Canary. What about you?
Yeah, I did. It was meatier. It was like less slight, I guess, because there were more murders as well.
Yeah.
So there was a bit more of that conversation about, okay, so who is it then? I think the house was less characterful.
Yes,
than
definitely.
The Cat and the Canary.
Although there's some fun stuff with looking through keyholes to adjoining rooms.
There's an amazing scene. But apart from that, I like you said, it does look slightly cheaper. It looks a bit more like a set.
Yes.
Than, less like a house that you want to get lost in. This feels, weirdly, I don't know, despite the fact that so much horror goes on in The Cat and the Canary, you still want to go and look at that house and explore it. Whereas in this house, I was less fussed about the house itself. And again, I don't know if it was because I just couldn't grasp the geography of it. There are a lot of like shared bathrooms and that sort of stuff, but it wasn't as fun. They didn't do as much fun stuff with it, which is a shame. It was a bit of a missed opportunity. But yeah, I did really enjoy it.
The fun they have is with those adjoining bedrooms, right? Where they can all look in on each other through the keyholes. There's quite a few scenes where that happens.
Yeah, they're just spying on each other.
Yeah.
They're never on the toilet.
No. No. But yeah, and there's a few moments like that where people are able to go missing for that reason. And there's a moment when somebody creeps out of a window and is able to crawl along to get into the next window and that kind of thing. But you're right. I don't think the film looks as good as The Cat and the Canary. It's got that slightly. I mean, it looks more British than Hollywood, doesn't it? That's the thing.
Oh, well, I suppose it is.
Exactly.
It's Devon, it's not the Bayou.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But, there are... I don't know how much of it was a set and how much of it was actually on location, because some of it is definitely... They're out on the beach and that kind of thing as well. And out on these sort of grassy moors and that kind of thing where they discover a body. So, yeah, I mean, like, it's an interesting location and you do get quite a sense of place. But you're right, they don't necessarily use the big, old, dark house in the way that they could have, I think. Agatha Christie, generally, like, are you a fan of her work? Her mystery stories. Are you a big fan?
I don't think I've ever read an Agatha Christie, ever. But I love Poirot.
Yeah.
And, so that was very much like sort of bank holiday Monday afternoon watching was whichever David Suchet or Albert Finney film was on next sort of thing. Yeah. So it's more Poirot that I love. With the others that aren't part of the kind of those series, I'm really not that familiar with the adaptations. Obviously, like I said, I've never read the books. So, well, actually, I quite like that because it means that when there are adaptations, I don't know them all.
Yeah, I agree. I think I quite like that too. I'm not massively familiar with all of her work in the way that some people are. Obviously, I've seen some of those Poirot specials on TV or film adaptations or whatever it might be, but generally, I haven't read a lot of her books. But obviously, I mean, I'm sure most people out there know about Agatha Christie, right? She was this British writer. She had written 66 detective novels, and she's actually still, I believe, listed in the Guinness World Records as the best-selling fiction writer of all time, because her novels combined have sold 2 billion copies. She was well known, obviously, for her books about Poirot, but also Miss Marple. She's also responsible for the world's longest-running play, the murder mystery The Mousetrap, which has been in London's West End since 1952. It's never left. And And her works have inspired so many other works of fiction, which we've already mentioned. Everything from, Midsummer Murders to Knives Out, I suppose. She's been labelled the Duchess of Death, the Mistress of Mystery, the Queen of Crime, right? So early in her career, a reporter noted that her plots are possible, they're logical, and they're always new. At the start of each novel, she shows us an apparently impossible situation, and we go mad wondering, how can this be happening? Then slowly she reveals how impossible is not only possible, but the only thing that could have happened. So she really popularised this kind of mystery, this whodunit element, and her stories are all quite macabre. They do often feature a lot of grisly deaths and murders and plots to murder and all of that kind of thing. And of course, which is relevant to what we're talking about this series, so many of her stories took place in domestic settings, usually in big country manors or big English homes, usually in little rural English villages and that kind of thing, where essentially you get a bunch of people together under one roof who don't really trust each other, and then something bad happens. And that's how this idea of the Agatha Christie story links to movies like The Old Dark House, going all the way through to modern slasher movies, which we'll talk about as we go. And there are other elements to Agatha Christie too, which are slightly more problematic, which we'll get into. She does use a lot of racial stereotypes in her books, a lot of just out and out racism, in fact, in her books. And we'll talk a little bit about the title of And Then There Were None in a minute. But I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff to unpick with Agatha Christie, and I think it's fascinating how she is this kind of quaint, family-friendly, cross-generational writer, and yet she also feels kind of pivotal to the evolution of the horror genre, and particularly the slasher subgenre, which is kind of interesting.
The murder was fastidious. He cleaned this blade after striking down his victim. Obviously, he crept up behind, swung this chopper, and brought it down, splitting the cranium.
Because I always knew what the title of this book was, and you didn't, right? You never knew what the original title of And Then There Were None was. And I always did. And so I always knew that she definitely had racist elements.
Yeah,
in her writing.
She's kind of like Enid Blyton, isn't she? I kind of pair the two of them together.
Whereas with Enid Blyton, because I read her so much younger, I wasn't aware of the racism in her books until I was a bit older, and then it was explained to me.
Yeah,
and they use very, very similar iconography.
Yes,
racist iconography.
Yeah.
So you're right to kind of pair them.
I think I like Agatha Christie generally. I was never like into Poirot in the way that you and some people were, but whenever I've seen any adaptations, I generally quite enjoy them.
Yeah.
And Agatha Christie's fun because you anyone who reads or watches her stuff, you get to play the detective.
Exactly.
Right? That's what's really fun.
Yeah.
You get to figure it out yourself, and when they're done well, I think those are really satisfying to watch or read. Or we went into a theatre production of Witness for the Prosecution in London together, didn't we? That was actually kind of set. It was actually staged in a courthouse.
Yeah.
So we sat in the, what do you call it? The stools. I don't know what you call it, but we were sat in the seats in the courtroom.
Yeah.
And some audience members actually had to sit in the jury pen and had to read their verdict and stuff while these actors played out this courtroom drama. And I really enjoyed that. That was like a really fun mystery that played out, and in a really cool setting as well.
Yeah.
And it just seems to be very Agatha Christie seems to be very cross-generational. Like, obviously, I feel like more than anything, it will be like our grandparents' generation that will love it. But I'm sure that some young people probably enjoy some of these mysteries as well,
And also because they are so easy to update.
Yes.
For newer audiences. And the kind of the classic whodunit is always going to be a popular...
Yeah, and Kenneth Branagh now has brought them back in a big way.
But not critically, as in not to critical acclaim, interestingly. And I don't know if by this point, because he kind of looked at the two of the most famous ones, which are Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, because now actually most people do know the endings of those, whether it doesn't work quite so well as an like the twists. We know the twists.
Yeah, I know. It's true. Like, I mean, they are still doing commercially well, though, these films.
Yeah,
they're all-star casts and, again, like our parents or grandparents' generation, I think, flock to see those movies. I guess Rian Johnson is doing, for me, more interesting versions of these stories.
Agreed.
Slightly skewed younger, but they are doing the same thing as Agatha Christie, right? Essentially what the Knives Out movies are Agatha Christie like stories.
It's interesting what you're saying about this kind of skewing younger, because with the with Glass Onion, I think my parents watched it and they were like, didn't get it, don't
exactly,
like, why is that funny? Like, didn't understand it really at all, like the as in the popularity of it. Whereas my dad 100% would like loved the older Suchet Poirot, that sort of old, like more old-fashioned, more traditional. Perhaps there are just too many sort of references to new technologies and things that are happening in the world at the moment that don't quite wash with my parents' generation.
I think for me, classic, I always wanted there to be a little bit more horror in these horror stories, because they're so often about murders and death. But it doesn't really focus in on that. And when I was growing up, as you know, we both I loved Jonathan Creek, and Jonathan Creek kind of almost felt like a more gothic, over-the-top version of an Agatha Christie mystery as well. Do you know what I mean? Like, it had these same kind of things, these whodunit elements, these body found in a locked room of an old mansion gothic house, except that this was weirder and scarier and usually sillier too, than Agatha Christie, but more fun. I found more fun to watch.
So fun. I love Jonathan Creek. When are we doing our Jonathan Creek podcast?
Well, if you want to talk like cool houses, Jonathan Creek has some of the best ones.
Yeah, it does.
Right? Yeah.
But also it's interesting. So Ewan Owen, who is the owner of the house in And Then There Were None, is, they very quickly work out, is unknown. Which is something that Jonathan Creek does quite a few times. Septimus Noon.
Yes. Yeah, that's
Septimus No One.
Exactly, that's the thing. Like, you can see Agatha Christie's influence on everything, right? Everything from Jonathan Creek to Knives Out to any other whodunit or murder mystery.
She was the original. It feels like she was so incredibly influential. And as you say, like, gave very like satisfying endings that weren't immediately obvious from the outset. Like the twist in Murder on the Orient Express, it's such a brilliant one because everyone's suspicions is correct.
Yes, exactly.
Such a, but hadn't really been done before.
No. And this is I mentioned it already briefly, but this is a kind of interesting story in that it really is often thought of as the forerunner to the slasher genre. And Then There Were None. This idea of we start with 10 characters and we end up with one sole survivor, and they all die in different grisly, gruesome ways. Some are shot, some are stabbed, some are poisoned, somebody gets their head smashed in with an axe, don't they, or something? In this, and so like it's you don't see it in all its glory, but you could see the blueprint here, all the way through to the final act where the killer is revealed and kind of sits there and kind of recounts his motive. That's like a Scream movie. It's like any Scream movie, isn't it? Or Friday or the original Friday the 13th. Like, you can see the really interesting blueprint and how this kind of inspired Italian mystery stories, like what people call giallo, which is all kind of, again, a prowler on the loose. But those movies concentrated way more on the kills. So it was the same kind of thing, a mystery of a man with black gloves and a knife and he would be murdering people, except that those movies concentrated on like buckets of blood and screaming and naked women, and it was much more about the spectacle, and often the story didn't make any sense at all. And then that progresses to American slasher movies that become, suddenly we're only watching movies for the kills and not for the storyline most of the time. But you can see it kind of traced back in a way to And Then There Were None, which is interesting.
7 little Indian boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in half. And then there were 6.
Would it have needed much strength to strike the blow?
Well, a woman could have done it, if that's what you mean.
Miss Claythorne was locked in her room, Doctor, if that's what you mean.
We were all in our room.
So, should we talk about the title of this story? Because this is weird, because such a pivotal part of this story is that there is this poem at the center of it, right? And the poem actually predates the story, right? It was an existing poem that went back to the 19th century, called 10 Little Indians, right? And it's a really dark poem. It's about 10 people being killed in really gruesome ways.
This is it. I think originally it wasn't. I think the original one is there are some deaths, but not all of them. It's not quite as not every one ends in a horrific one. For example, like the one little Indian living all alone, he got married and then there were none.
Right.
Is what is the original.
Okay.
And then, of course, I think there have been so many iterations of this, and from so many different countries.
Yes.
That it's really difficult to kind of like trace back what was the original, what was inspired by what, because there was an Icelandic one as well, which was again used that same incredibly racist iconography.
It's like a nursery rhyme that's been adapted and changed from generation to generation or country to country.
It was like a minstrel song initially, and then it was really popular with children because I guess it's very repetitive.
Yes.
And so then it kind of became a nursery rhyme, and
yes.
But then of course it's got very, like, as you say, like genocidal overtones.
So as far as we're aware though, the original title was 10 Little Indians, right? Meaning Native Americans. But then at some point,
because I think it was Injuns.
Yeah.
INJUNS.
Yeah. And then it got changed. Like you said, it got kind of used in minstrel shows and that kind of thing. And then it got changed to 10 Little N-words, which I had no idea that's what it was called. And that was actually the original title of Agatha Christie's story. If you look up the book on Wikipedia, it has a picture of the original cover. And I was just like, holy shit, I can't believe that's what it was called. And in the UK, it was called that all the way until 1985. There were still versions of it being published under that name until 1985.
That's horrific.
Insane.
That's horrific.
Even in the US, they changed it. They changed that title to...
And then there were none.
Earlier than
I think in the 40s, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but it's also been published under the title 10 Little Indians as well. So it's had various different titles. But that's a scarily dated racist thing connected to this, isn't it? And also because the poem itself is so gruesome and violent and horrible, but also the fact that it's a nursery rhyme, and that's sort of nothing new. I mean, look at like Ring a Roses. Totally. Like all nursery rhymes are to do with death,
and fairy tales. Yeah, I don't think that that's completely normal. It's like it's all that, the parables scaring children off things, and
exactly.
And like there is a sort of element of it being, for example, like, one of them is a bee stinging them because one of the boys was playing with a hive. One of them was playing with an axe, and so he cut himself in half. But it's all really nasty. Yeah, overtly violent.
It's not like
but also like self. It's all about things that they do to themselves.
Yes,
really.
Yes, yeah, One, 7 little Indian boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in half, and then there were 6. Like, what? These are really gruesome.
Yeah.
And these are the inspiration for the murders that happen in the film, and then there were none, right? Or in Agatha Christie's story.
Well, I think was she the one that changed them to be this explicit as well?
I can't quite find.
I know, it's
evidence
so hard. It's
because
so confusing.
I think that there were versions of this poem as it is before.
Right.
I think there were.
Yeah.
But then this story popularized that particular version. It's really hard to trace it. I don't know exactly, but yes. So that kind of much more gruesome, violent version of the poem is the inspiration for the murders in And Then There Were None.
Yeah,
and it's fun because they don't stick entirely to the ways in which people die in the poem.
It's not so predictable, is it? It's not like, because it says this exact thing, then that's exactly the way they die. Sometimes it's really literal. Yeah, and then sometimes they do have quite a lot of fun with the various deaths.
As we were watching it, and I googled the poem, and I was like, the next one is apparently 6 little Indians playing with a hive, a bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5. I was like, what's going to happen? Is somebody going to get killed by a bee?
But that is what happens in Jonathan Creek.
That's what happened. And that isn't what happens in the story, though, is it? They find a bee flying around in the window and there's a woman who's not waking up.
Yeah.
But
it's actually, she's been injected with something from the doctor. I think it's essentially maybe gone into like anaphylactic shock or something.
Yeah,
or,
so something
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's fun. So I kind of enjoyed that element of it. And I think that's what keeps the movie kind of ticking along, is that you're going, oh, who's going to die next? How are they going to die? And we were constantly discussing and trying to work out who we think was the murderer.
Yeah,
right?
there's a lot going on in this movie.
Really, really fun. What do you think of our cast of characters then, and the actors that play them? Were you into this cast? Did you enjoy them generally?
Yeah, again, there are far more men than women, and it's weirdly, it's quite, and they're all wearing the same sort of evening dress suits. So initially, it's quite difficult. I think you struggled particularly to just like.
Yeah, I didn't know who was who.
No, you had no idea. No. I could only figure it out more by their accents, because they all had like varying. Degrees of weird, wonderful accents in this.
There were a lot of older men with moustaches. That was what I got confused by. It was all the men with moustaches.
What I like about this is that they all introduce themselves and they break the fourth wall and they all introduce themselves to us, and that feels so sitcom-y.
It's a very weird thing.
It's so weird, but it's also again very knowing, and it's just like, I'm this person, and you feel very much like you're in Cluedo.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I thought that was quite funny, because it sets the tone, being like, this isn't going to be completely serious. This is all going to be a bit tongue-in-cheek, which is kind of necessary, I think. I do think murder mysteries often need to have humour laced through them, because the idea of them is so stupid, really, that anybody stuck on a... Because even Murder on the Orient Express is also very funny and has some really stupid bits in it.
Yeah, for sure.
It needs to, as that levity which makes the horror even more gruesome somehow.
Yeah.
I think because there are a lot of funny, entertaining characters in this. Sometimes a bit too over the top, but unlike The Cat and the Canary, they point out, for example, there's a character called Prince Nicky Starloff, who he's the one that kind of goes on the piano and plays this song in the first place, and the poem, and everyone is just like, oh, when is he ever going to shut up? Which is, it's funny because we're all thinking it as well. So it's very aware of its audience, this movie, which is quite nice, because it means that we're in on the joke.
Yeah, agreed. And I like this backstory that they're all awful people and murderers as well, and they're all responsible for different people dying in one way or another. I thought that was quite a fun touch as well. And again, there is this kind of, I guess, a kind of slight class element to this in a way, isn't there?
Yeah, but you're right. You're right to hesitate, because there's the kind of the servants who have also, they've killed their previous mistress, right? For her inheritance or her money. And they equally get bumped off.
Yes.
And they are very much seen as like the underclass in this. And the male servant, Thomas, is expected to carry on being a servant despite the fact that his wife has just died in this house. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I could only cobble together like whatever it was. And they're like, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
They're not like, oh no, don't worry, just go and recover, go and grieve for your wife.
Yeah, no, they're like, no, we still need you to cook for us. Yeah, it's great.
That privilege is mad.
Yes. And there's that really quite sinister older woman.
Yeah, loved her.
Judith Anderson as Emily Brent, who basically talks about how she put one of her relatives,
her nephew,
into a kind of
an asylum or something, right? Like a psychiatric unit?
Or a kind of correctional facility or something like that, right? And then they end up taking their own life. Yeah. And she's very matter-of-fact about it.
Yeah.
Couldn't care less.
She kind of does it while she's over making soup or like she's cooking something. She's like, yep, and I don't have any regrets.
Yeah.
I was like, wow.
Your young nephew, aren't you to blame for his death? My sister's boy had bad blood, from his father's side, of course. Whipping did no good. Naturally, I had to have him placed in the reformatory. I do hope these eggs aren't overcooked.
What happened to the boy?
Oh, I never saw him again. He added to his many sins by hanging himself.
She's terrifying,
Yeah.
but I love how terrifying she is. She feels like a genuinely kind of evil presence.
Yeah.
Whereas the others are all like, no, I didn't. I couldn't possibly have. Oh, okay, maybe.
Yeah.
Whereas she's just like, yeah. And what?
And what? I did it and I'd do it again, see?
Yeah. It was that sort of like ownership of it. And I kind of like the fact that she never really actually seems to be frightened. You know, she goes out for a walk. She collects that seaweed. Do you remember?
Yes.
Like she's like, oh, this would make a lovely pattern or something.
Yes.
She's got her own shit going on. And she's not completely enthralled to this whole setup. That has been laid out for them, and I kind of admired her for that.
Well, it's funny because there's also our sort of leading man who is you could tell who was going to be the final couple to survive because there was our sort of lead couple. So our main character of who we think is Philip Lombard, he turns out not to be Philip Lombard, right? Because he's pretending to be someone else, played by Louis Haywood.
Yeah.
And Vera Claythorne, played by June Duprez. You know, our sort of young, good-looking
leading
couple,
lady.
our leading lady
Yeah.
and man, and he's so funny because he's just like suave, smiley, handsome man throughout the whole thing as well. Very unfazed by everything happening.
Completely. He just wants to get his end away, really.
Yeah, he just seems to be having a lovely time throughout. He basically doesn't stop smiling.
I know, and it's really sinister in this setting. But I guess because he genuinely doesn't have the whole twist is that he isn't Philip Lombard.
That's right. Philip Lombard, who killed 21 South African tribesmen.
But you never find out in what context. No. Like, did he line them all up and shoot them? Or
was it some sort of
that he led
scenario?
them into something where they all died and he survived? You know, like, again, it's all a bit woolly.
Yeah.
I will say it's woolly.
There might be more of it in the novel, to be fair, which we haven't read.
Yeah, I think I quite enjoy hearing about all of the motives or all of those bits of detail. And I do think they gloss over them a bit. Do you? What do you mean? Their backstories, their crimes. Yeah,
they don't dwell on it much.
They don't linger. Yeah,
it's not like an Inspector Calls. It reminds me a bit of an Inspector Calls as well. How that whole family were responsible for the death of Eva Smith, was it? And it really, really spends so much time on each family member and what they do to her. This kind of almost structurally has that same kind of thing. That's
true.
Except that it's you're right. It's less interested on everything that they've done in the past. It's kind of a few throwaway lines here and there, isn't it? And more about who is killing them in the present, which is fair enough. That's the main mystery.
What's your favourite death?
I like the man that gets the axe in the face. We don't see it, but we just see his like legs. He's like lying upside down with an axe in it.
They're like, oh well, it's definitely him. Well, we can see that his legs. He's dead in a bush.
Holy shit, that's pretty brutal. Yes. What about you?
I like the one that sort of harks forward to Hot Fuzz, like the guy who's just standing under the statue that gets pushed on top of his head.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Which is how Adam Buxton dies in Hot Fuzz.
Yeah, that's good, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a good one.
And this is, it's interesting. So we should talk about the reveal because the killer himself is actually one of the victims who dies. Gets a bullet in the head, but not really, right? And so we end up with like only a couple of characters left on the beach, our sort of main couple. And so you kind of think, well, does it have to be him
one of those? Yeah,
it has to be Philip.
But he's been, I don't know, because he's almost set up to be so maybe sinister, but also our leading man. And we know how old Hollywood works, that they wouldn't make. It's like the whole thing about Cary Grant in Suspicion, where the whole way through he's trying to murder his wife, but the ending didn't wash with audiences, so Hitchcock had to change the ending to make it that he wasn't trying to murder his wife. So yeah, we know that audiences don't enjoy having their leading man actually turn out to be the baddie. So we knew it couldn't be that.
And it's interesting because there's like a double crossing here because our main couple are on the beach. She realizes that she has to shoot him because she thinks he's the killer, or appears to think he's the killer. And we hear a shot fired and we see him drop. And then she returns to the house by herself, and that's when she finds the noose hanging for her, because the poem ends with the last person hanging themselves. But then, of course, it's revealed that the killer is a guy called Quinn Cannon, who is a judge, played by Barry Fitzgerald, who had faked his death earlier on, right? He had a fake bullet wound in his in the middle of his forehead.
Yes. You suspected him from the start.
I knew. Well, also the fact that he was a judge.
Yeah.
I was like, well, it's clearly like this person is a judge, jury, and executioner, you know?
I am not judge, jury, and executioner.
And then, again, quite a sort of dark, macabre ending where he basically reveals, I'm dying of a terminal illness. I wanted to kill you all. I'm going to take some poison and kill myself now so then she will be the only person left. She'll either have the choice to hang herself or she'll be done for all the murders and go to prison, right? Yeah, it's good. It's a good moment. And then, of course, it turns out that Philip is still alive, that they faked his shooting. And by this point, the killer has poisoned himself. So he just sort of sits there in his chair and just
dies.
And dies, yeah.
And then they go off and have, as you say, they're happily ever after.
Yeah.
They have, like, again, a real screwball comedy ending.
Despite the fact that there are just, like, tens of dead bodies around them.
I know, it's so dark. And it is really jarring and weird. But yeah, the idea that this judge, who he's actually like one of the best characters throughout. I like that, you know, he's always at the fore. He's the chattiest one. He's the one who's driving it all. He's asking lots of questions. He's trying to get them to all sort of judge each other as well. And he's always stirring the pot. He's one of the most entertaining and gets drunk, so apparently, with the doctor, who is an actual alcoholic.
Yes.
So I really like that we get to know the killer very well, which we don't really in the Cat and the Canary.
No. No, I think that's what makes it feel satisfying.
Yeah.
That it gets to be him at the end.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also the fact that for all that he does, he actually got it wrong, because the whole reason why we're allowed our happy ending with this couple is that neither of them are actually the murderers.
Yes.
So one of them has just taken the identity of his friend, who was the one who killed the 21 South African tribesmen. And then Vera was accused of murdering her sister's fiance, but it turned out that her sister actually murdered her own fiance.
Yeah.
And she sort of apparently took the blame. I'm like, why did you though? Like, there's sisterly love and then there's that.
I know.
So, but that's why they're allowed to have their happy ending. And it means that this man who thought he was so fucking clever actually got two very wrong.
Yeah. That's lucky that, isn't it? That the two that survived were the two that didn't happen to actually commit any murders. It's great. It's a very neat ending, isn't it?
It is very neat. There are some which are again a bit sad, like the old boy who kind of wanders off and he keeps thinking that everyone's his wife. Do you remember? He sort of like feels like he's losing it a little bit, and it turns out that he killed his wife's lover, right? Or at least sent him to his death. I can't remember exactly the detail, but I don't know. That all feels that is quite sad. There's so much like betrayal and devastation in these lives. That's what I mean. It would have been really cool to sort of unearth all of that a little bit more. It's all just very surface.
Yeah, and I guess it all depends what you come to these movies for. You know, some people just want that fun murder mystery ride, you know, and a fun little body count movie or a whodunit or whatever.
As opposed to make you care, like, we don't really care about any of the characters.
Definitely not.
So so it's easy for them just to be offed.
Yes, exactly. It makes everything a bit more palatable, doesn't
it?
That basically literally everyone that dies in this film is a murderer, or at least is responsible for somebody's death. Like for one of them, it was a kind of drink driving accident, wasn't it? So all of them are responsible for killing people, all of the people that die, and our two survivors are squeaky clean. And again, that kind of links forward to this idea of the slasher format, that often the victims are being punished for their sins in some way. The only people that make it out of it alive are usually pure in some way. And again, it comes right back to this, doesn't it? It comes right back to, and then there were none.
The whole thing has been as inevitable as the nursery rhyme. When the boat arrives in the mainland, there'll be 10 dead bodies and a riddle no one can solve on Indian Island.
10?
My dear child, I'm an old and sick man. I received my death sentence a year ago. Rather than go painfully and slowly, I choose to leave this wicked world with a proud record of good deeds.
But how can you force me to hang myself?
The only living person found here with 9 corpses will certainly be hanged, as the last little Indian has to be. Public hanging isn't pretty. If you'll allow me to give you a piece of friendly advice, do it now, privately. more dignified.
And then the judge judges himself because he sort of sentenced somebody, an innocent man, to death because he didn't like his lawyer.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty fucking dark.
That is really dark, yeah.
That's one of the darkest. He doesn't even have any actual relation to the murdered man.
Mm-hmm.
It was just getting one over on somebody else.
Yeah.
He wanted to destroy his reputation.
Yeah.
And so he is one of the most horrific out of all of those people.
Yeah.
I mean, no, you can't really say that as in, I'm not judging the other ones, but they all had like a motive for that particular person's death.
Yeah.
If they were murderers, and he didn't. It wasn't anything to do with it. That could have been any random person.
I know.
Wild.
Brutal. Yeah, really fun film. I really, really enjoyed it. It was great. You know, like I'm all for give me a bunch of people and kill them off in a house one by one.
What did you think about like the setting on the island, like the idea of the island and their isolation? Did that all make sense to you?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I think it just justifies narratively the fact that they can't all just leave after that first body comes. You know, they can't just get away. The fact that they are literally on this private island, there's no boat coming for them until the end of the weekend. It works in just cutting them off, doesn't it? And making everyone unsafe. But also knowing that whoever this murderer is there the whole time and you know, is findable as well, you know. So yeah, I think that really works. Again, like they don't do a huge amount with it sort of cinematically. There's a couple of cool scenes that happen on a beach and there's a person that drowns, but it's quite fleeting. It's mainly just sort of people talking in dining rooms and drawing rooms and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and there's an axe shed and
yes, which is quite cool. Yeah.
Which has a bed in it for the servants apparently.
Yeah.
But yeah, I liked the island aspect. And again, it's that we see that sort of, we often romanticize that idea of British countryside or beaches or you know, that idyllic place, but actually that's where some of the darkest things can happen in isolation.
Yeah.
And it does fall into the comedy aspect, as in it does push the comedy aspect a few times, like really quite to the extremes, when they all go through the bathroom. They're all following each other through the keyhole. They're looking through the keyhole. Yeah. Then they're opening the door, and then someone is spying on them, and they're trying to see where the person in front has gone. Yeah. And it suddenly becomes like a weird chain of about 5 people who are all like following each other around the house.
Yes. Yes.
Doing this weird sort of like tag team thing. And it's visually hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fun. I quite liked that sequence.
Yeah, I did. It was great. And I like that it wasn't afraid to sort of lean into the more slapstick side of comedy. Yeah. When it needed to.
Agreed. Yeah. It's a real kind of fun crowd pleaser of a film in that regard, I think.
Yeah,
definitely.
It is.
Awesome. Well, there you go. Well, thank you so much for joining me to discuss these two very fun, light-hearted, whimsical
murder mysteries.
Yeah, really, really fun. What's your favourite kind of murder mystery whodunit movie?
Oh, I love Gosford Park.
Gosford Park, yeah.
I love Gosford Park. And I rewatched it recently, and it's so good and it's so satisfying. And again, the whole upstairs, I mean, ultimate class differences. But all of the ensemble cast in that is incredible. And again, the house is quite fun. Yeah. But, you know, seeing the servants' quarters and I just feel like everybody's at the top of their game in that film. Apart from maybe Stephen Fry, who comes into it as the inspector and is...
Well, it's that slightly more kind of broad comedy thing again, isn't it, with that? Yeah. It
kind of feels like he's in Pink Panther or something, I don't know.
Yeah. There's always such all-star casts in those sorts of films, aren't they? It's like Knives Out as well. It's like it's an amazing who's who often in these sorts of films. Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
What's yours?
It would be Knives Out. The first Knives Out, I think.
Really, of all time?
I think so, unless you count Scream. You know, that's obviously the best. But in terms of these more, you know, traditional Agatha Christie-esque movies, I would say Knives Out for me. Yeah, the first one, I think it did everything perfectly. Well, there you go. Well, thank you so much. And just remind people where they can find you and more of your stuff out there online.
I am on 6 Music every Monday morning. I'm on 5 Live most Thursday afternoons. And I also do a podcast called Pod, which is all about podcasting for podcasters like yourself.
Amazing.
You've been mentioned quite a few times on it.
I know. I love it whenever I get brought up.
Free advertising.
I know. It's great. It's great. I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Rhianna Dhillon. So please do get in touch. Let us know what you thought of these two fun-filled films, And Then There Were None and The Cat and the Canary. You can send me your thoughts to evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror Discord or the Evolution of Horror discussion group. Don't forget, if you want to keep an eye on upcoming events we've got, screenings and live podcasts around the UK, head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events. And if you want to receive weekless bonus episodes, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So on to next week then, and things are slowly getting a little bit less comedic and a little bit darker as they go on. Next week we're going to be talking about two prestigious dramas about women being driven mad in big old houses. Next week I'm going to be joined by a brand new guest, Laura Perrichon, and we're going to be discussing Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca from 1940 and George Cukor's Gaslight from 1944. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.